In the unforgiving world of military service, where strength is measured by the weight you can carry and the distance you can march, Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell had already proven the doubters wrong once. She had clawed her way back from a devastating IED explosion that took her left leg below the knee, refusing to let a piece of twisted metal end her career. But standing in that dusty briefing room, watching General Harrison's eyes linger on her prosthetic with barely concealed disgust, she realized her biggest battle wasn't against enemy forces. It was against the prejudice of her own commanding officer. "I don't care what the Pentagon says about inclusion," the general had muttered just loud enough for her to hear. "A soldier with spare parts has no business on my base." What the general didn't know was that in less than 72 hours, those very spare parts would be the only thing standing between him and a shallow grave in the Afghan mountains. Sometimes the people we underestimate the most become the heroes we never saw coming. This is the story of how a ridiculed soldier with a prosthetic leg became the savior of the man who tried to destroy her career, and why courage isn't measured by the completeness of your body, but by the strength of your spirit. The morning sun cast long shadows across forward operating Base Thunder as Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stepped off the transport helicopter, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder, and her chin held high despite the curious stares from soldiers gathered near the landing pad. The rhythmic thump of her prosthetic against the metal ramp announced her arrival louder than any fanfare could have. She had been away for 18 months of grueling rehabilitation, surgery, and training, but now she was back where she belonged in the field, ready to serve her country. Sarah had always been different from other soldiers, even before the explosion that changed her life forever. Growing up in rural Montana, she learned to hunt before she could properly tie her shoes, and by age 12, she could outshoot most grown men in her county. Her father, a Vietnam veteran, had instilled in her a deep respect for military service and an unshakable belief that true strength came from within. When she enlisted at 18, she quickly rose through the ranks, earning respect from her peers and superiors alike for her tactical brilliance and unwavering dedication. The IED that took her leg had been hidden beneath a pile of rubble on what should have been a routine patrol. Sarah remembered every detail of that day with crystal clarity: the way the morning light filtered through the dust, the smell of diesel fuel mixing with the arid Afghan air, and the sound of her squad leader's voice calling out coordinates over the radio. Then came the explosion, a thunderclap that seemed to tear the world in half. When the dust settled and the ringing in her ears finally subsided, she looked down to see her left leg mangled beyond recognition, her military boot lying several feet away from her body. But Sarah Mitchell had never been one to surrender, not even to devastating injury. During her long months of recovery, while other wounded soldiers struggled with depression and acceptance, she threw herself into rehabilitation with the same intensity she had once applied to combat training. Physical therapy sessions that left grown men weeping became stepping stones toward her goal. Learning to walk again with a prosthetic limb was just another mission to complete, another objective to achieve. The prosthetic itself was a marvel of modern engineering, titanium, and carbon fiber that had cost the military more than most soldiers earned in a year. Sarah had named it Liberty, partly as a joke about her freedom to continue serving, but mostly because it represented her liberation from the limitations others tried to impose on her. She spent countless hours learning to run, jump, and even climb with her new leg, pushing the boundaries of what doctors said was possible. Now, as she walked across the base toward the command center, she could feel eyes following her every step. Some soldiers looked at her with admiration. Word of her determination during recovery had spread through military channels like wildfire. Others stared with curiosity, wondering how someone with a prosthetic leg could possibly contribute to active duty operations. But it was the third group that concerned her most, those who looked at her with pity, as if she were some wounded bird that should have stayed safely in a cage rather than returning to the wild. The command center buzzed with activity as Sarah approached. Officers hunched over maps and computer screens, coordinating supply drops and planning patrol routes. The familiar chaos of military operations felt like coming home after a long absence. She straightened her uniform and approached the reception desk, where a young corporal was sorting through a stack of paperwork. "Lieutenant Mitchell reporting for duty," she announced, handing over her transfer orders. The corporal looked up from his papers, his eyes immediately dropping to her prosthetic leg before quickly returning to her face. "Yes, ma'am. General Harrison is expecting you in his office," Third door down the hall on your right." Sarah thanked him and made her way down the corridor, her footsteps echoing against the concrete walls. She had heard stories about General Harrison during her recovery, a decorated combat veteran with 3 tours in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan, known for his tactical brilliance, but also for his old-school mentality about military service. Some said he was the kind of leader who inspired absolute loyalty in his troops. Others whispered that he had little patience for anything he perceived as weakness. The general's office door stood slightly ajar, and Sarah could hear his voice inside, speaking in clipped, authoritative tones to someone on the phone. She knocked twice and waited for permission to enter. "Come in," came the gruff response. General Harrison sat behind a massive wooden desk that looked like it had seen combat itself, scarred and weathered but still imposing. He was younger than Sarah had expected, probably in his early 40s, with steel-gray eyes and the kind of rigid posture that spoke of decades in uniform. When he looked up at her, those eyes immediately traveled down to her prosthetic leg and stayed there for several uncomfortable seconds before returning to her face. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said, not bothering to stand or offer his hand. "I've read your file, impressive service record before your incident." Sarah felt the slight emphasis he placed on the word incident, like a slap across the face, but she maintained her military bearing. "Thank you, sir. I'm ready to return to active duty and serve wherever you need me most." General Harrison leaned back in his chair, studying her with the intensity of a predator sizing up potential prey. "The thing is, Lieutenant, I'm not sure where someone in your condition fits into my operation. This isn't some desk job back in the States where you can take your time getting around. Out here, every soldier needs to be able to carry their weight, literally and figuratively." The words stung, but Sarah had prepared herself for this kind of reception. "Sir, I've passed all required physical fitness tests and completed advanced combat training with my prosthetic. My marksmanship scores are actually higher now than they were before my injury. I'm fully capable of performing any duties you assign." "Test scores are one thing," the general replied, his voice taking on a condescending tone. "But what happens when you're under fire and that artificial leg of yours malfunctions? What happens when my soldiers have to carry you out because your equipment fails? I've got real soldiers' lives to worry about, not someone playing pretend." Sarah felt her cheeks flush with anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. "With respect, sir, every piece of military equipment can malfunction. My prosthetic has backup systems and has been tested under extreme conditions. I'm not playing pretend, I'm a soldier, same as anyone else on this base." General Harrison stood up and walked around his desk, stopping just close enough to invade her personal space, a classic intimidation tactic she had seen used on new recruits. "Let me be clear, Lieutenant. I don't care what the Pentagon says about equal opportunity or inclusion. In my experience, soldiers with spare parts are liabilities waiting to happen. I'll find you something to do that won't put real soldiers at risk, but don't expect any special treatment just because you're some kind of inspiration story." The meeting continued for another 20 minutes, with General Harrison outlining her assignments, mostly administrative tasks and training duties that would keep her safely away from actual combat operations. Sarah listened with growing frustration as he systematically dismantled every hope she had harbored about returning to meaningful service. When she was finally dismissed, she walked out of his office feeling more defeated than she had even in her darkest moments during recovery. Over the following days, Sarah threw herself into her assigned duties with the same determination that had carried her through rehabilitation. She organized supply inventories, updated personnel files, and assisted with training new recruits on the firing range. The work was important, but it felt like a waste of her skills and experience. She watched enviously as other soldiers prepared for patrol missions and combat operations, activities she had once lived for but was now denied. The other soldiers' reactions to her varied widely. Many of the enlisted men and junior officers treated her with the respect due her rank and showed genuine admiration for her return to service. They peppered her with questions about her prosthetic, her recovery, and her determination to continue serving. These interactions reminded her why she had fought so hard to return. The military wasn't just her career, it was her family. However, she also encountered those who had clearly adopted General Harrison's perspective. She overheard whispered comments about dead weight and publicity stunts when people thought she couldn't hear. Some soldiers seemed uncomfortable around her, as if her presence reminded them of their own mortality and vulnerability. Others treated her with exaggerated kindness that felt more insulting than outright hostility. One evening, while reviewing training schedules in the command center, Sarah overheard a conversation that made her blood boil. General Harrison was speaking with his senior staff about an upcoming high-risk mission to establish a new observation post in enemy territory. The discussion was animated and detailed, covering everything from insertion points to extraction procedures. "What about additional personnel?" asked Major Collins, the base's operations officer. "Mitchell has the right qualifications for reconnaissance work." General Harrison's laugh was harsh and dismissive. "That crippled desk jockey? I wouldn't send her to guard a supply depot, let alone on a real mission. I don't care what her file says, soldiers with artificial parts have no business in combat zones. One malfunction and she becomes everyone else's problem." Sarah felt her hands clench into fists as she listened to the man sworn to lead and protect his soldiers dismiss her with such casual cruelty. The word crippled hit her like a physical blow, not because she believed it, but because it represented everything she had fought against during her recovery. She had endured months of agony and doubt, pushed her body beyond what doctors thought possible, and proven her capabilities time and again, only to be reduced to a single word by someone who had never bothered to see her true potential. That night, alone in her quarters, Sarah stared at her prosthetic leg propped against the wall beside her bunk. Liberty had carried her through countless miles of rehabilitation, helped her reclaim her identity as a soldier, and given her the freedom to continue serving her country. But in General Harrison's eyes, it would always be a symbol of weakness, a mark of her inadequacy. She thought about her father's words from years ago, spoken when she was struggling through basic training and questioning whether she was tough enough for military life. "Strength isn't about what you're born with," he had told her during a late-night phone call. "It's about what you do when life tries to break you. The strongest people I've ever known were those who got knocked down and got back up anyway." Sarah had gotten back up. She had refused to let an enemy's bomb define her future or limit her dreams. But now she faced a different kind of enemy, one wearing the same uniform she did, one who saw her sacrifice and dedication as nothing more than an inconvenience to be managed. As she drifted off to sleep that night, Sarah made herself a promise. Somehow, someway, she would prove General Harrison wrong. She would show him and everyone else who doubted her that courage and competence weren't measured by the intactness of one's body, but by the strength of one's spirit and the depth of one's commitment to the mission. She had no way of knowing that within days, circumstances would give her exactly the opportunity she sought, and that the man who had ridiculed and dismissed her would soon owe his very life to the soldier he had called a liability. Sometimes fate has a sense of irony that borders on the poetic, and sometimes the people who need rescuing most are those who never thought they needed a hero. The weeks following Sarah's confrontation with General Harrison's prejudice settled into a routine that felt more like punishment than service. Each morning, she reported to the administrative offices where stacks of paperwork awaited her attention. Supply requisitions, personnel reports, equipment maintenance logs, all important work, but far removed from the combat operations she had trained her entire career to handle. She watched through office windows as other soldiers prepared for missions, loaded into helicopters, and departed for objectives that might have been perfect for someone with her skills. During her lunch breaks, Sarah often found herself at the base's shooting range, the one place where her competence was undeniable. Her marksmanship had indeed improved since receiving her prosthetic, partly due to the enhanced stability the titanium leg provided, but mostly because she had spent countless hours during recovery perfecting her technique. The sound of her rifle became a familiar comfort, each precise shot a small victory against those who doubted her capabilities. It was during one of these sessions that she first encountered Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez, a combat medic who had served 3 tours and earned a reputation for her fearlessness under fire. Rodriguez watched Sarah put 10 consecutive rounds through the bulls at 300 yards before approaching with obvious respect. "That's some impressive shooting, Lieutenant," Rodriguez said, her voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of her Texas upbringing. "I heard you qualified expert marksman even after your injury." Sarah ejected the magazine from her rifle and began cleaning the weapon with practiced efficiency. "The Army invested a lot in my training. Seemed wasteful not to maintain those skills." "Mind if I ask you something?" Rodriguez settled onto the bench beside her, her own rifle resting across her knees. What's it like dealing with Harrison's attitude? I've seen how he looks at you during briefings. The question caught Sarah off guard. She had assumed her encounters with the general were private matters, but apparently his disapproval was more obvious than she had hoped. It's part of the job, she replied diplomatically. Every leader has their own management style. Rodriguez snorted. Management style? The man acts like you're contagious. But let me tell you something, half the soldiers on this base think what you did, coming back after what happened to you, is the bravest thing they've ever seen. The other half are scared they couldn't do the same if it happened to them. Over the following days, Sarah began to notice that Rodriguez wasn't alone in her assessment. Soldiers who had initially seemed uncomfortable around her gradually began seeking her out for advice on training, equipment, and tactics. Her reputation as a marksman spread through the enlisted ranks, and she found herself unofficially mentoring younger soldiers who wanted to improve their shooting skills. One particular afternoon, while reviewing maintenance schedules for the base's communications equipment, Sarah overheard a heated argument from General Harrison's office. The door was slightly ajar, and voices carried into the hallway where she was working. Sir, we're talking about a strategic position that could give us eyes on 3 major enemy supply routes, Major Collins was saying, his voice tight with frustration. The intelligence value alone justifies the risk. And I'm telling you the risk is too high, Harrison responded. We'd need a small team, maybe 6 soldiers, to get in there undetected and establish the observation post. If they get compromised, extraction becomes nearly impossible. I'm not sending good soldiers on a suicide mission. Sarah found herself drawn closer to the conversation despite knowing she shouldn't eavesdrop. The details they discussed painted a picture of a critical mission, establishing an observation post on a ridge overlooking a valley that enemy forces used to move supplies and reinforcements. The intelligence gathered from such a position could save countless American lives by allowing preemptive strikes on enemy convoys. What if we wait for additional support from headquarters? Collins suggested. More soldiers, better equipment. By the time headquarters approves additional resources, the opportunity will be gone, Harrison replied. Intelligence indicates the enemy is planning to fortify that area within the next 2 weeks. After that, establishing an observation post becomes impossible. Sarah listened as the 2 officers continued their debate, weighing tactical advantages against potential casualties. The mission they described was exactly the kind of operation she had trained for throughout her career, high-risk reconnaissance requiring stealth, marksmanship, and the ability to operate independently in hostile territory. Her experience in similar operations during her previous tour made her uniquely qualified for such an assignment. That evening, Sarah made a decision that would have seemed reckless to anyone who didn't understand her desperation to prove herself. She requested a meeting with General Harrison, knowing full well that he would likely dismiss her input before she even finished speaking. The next morning, she stood outside his office door, her proposal written out in precise military format on official letterhead. She had spent hours crafting her argument, anticipating every objection he might raise and preparing counterarguments based on tactical doctrine and her own experience. "Come in," Harrison called after her knock. He looked up from his paperwork with obvious irritation when he saw who had requested the meeting. "What is it, Lieutenant? I'm busy preparing for an important operation." "Sir, I understand you're facing challenges with the observation post mission in Sector 7, Sarah began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'd like to volunteer for the assignment." Harrison's expression shifted from irritation to what might have been amusement if the situation weren't so serious. "You want to volunteer for a high-risk reconnaissance mission in enemy territory?" "Yes, sir. My experience in similar operations, combined with my marksmanship skills, make me well-suited for this type of assignment. I've studied the terrain maps and intelligence reports, and I believe a small team could successfully establish and maintain an observation post at the target location." The general stood up and walked to the large map covering one wall of his office. The target area was marked with red pins indicating known enemy positions and blue lines showing potential approach routes. "Lieutenant, this isn't some training exercise where you get a second chance if things go wrong. The soldiers assigned to this mission will be on their own for potentially weeks, surrounded by hostile forces, with minimal support and no guarantee of extraction if they're compromised." "I understand the risks, sir, but the intelligence value of that position could provide early warning for dozens of supply convoys and prevent enemy reinforcements from reaching forward positions. The strategic importance outweighs the personal risk. Harrison turned back to face her, his expression unreadable. Even if I believed you were capable of handling the physical demands of such a mission, which I don't, I wouldn't risk the lives of other soldiers by including someone whose equipment could fail at a critical moment. Sarah had anticipated this objection and was ready with her response. Sir, my prosthetic has been tested under extreme conditions and has never malfunctioned. It requires no external power source, has no electronic components that could be detected by enemy equipment, and actually provides enhanced stability for precision shooting. In many ways, it's more reliable than biological limbs, which can be injured or fatigued. You're asking me to bet American lives on your artificial leg, Harrison said, his voice dripping with disdain. That's not a gamble I'm willing to take. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes, with Sarah presenting detailed tactical plans and addressing every concern the general raised. She showed him documentation of her prosthetic specifications, her medical clearances, and her training records. She outlined how her experience in similar terrain could benefit the mission and how her marksmanship skills could provide crucial overwatch for the team. But for every argument she made, Harrison found a reason to dismiss her proposal. Her prosthetic was a liability. Her long absence from active duty meant she was out of practice. The mission was too important to risk on someone who might not be able to keep up with fully able-bodied soldiers. When she finally left his office, Sarah felt a familiar mixture of anger and determination. She had presented a compelling case for her inclusion in the mission, but Harrison's prejudices ran too deep to overcome with logic and evidence. He saw her as damaged goods, a broken soldier who should be grateful for any assignment that didn't put real soldiers at risk. That afternoon, while organizing equipment inventories in the supply depot, Sarah encountered Corporal James Wu, a communications specialist who had been selected for the observation post mission. Wu was a quiet, methodical soldier whose technical skills made him invaluable for maintaining contact with base command during extended operations. Heard you volunteered for our mission, Wu said, checking radio equipment against his inventory list. Harrison shot you down pretty quick, I'm guessing. He has concerns about my fitness for combat operations, Sarah replied diplomatically. Wu looked up from his work, his expression serious. For what it's worth, Lieutenant, I've seen your work on the range. If I was going to be stuck on a hilltop surrounded by enemy forces, I'd want someone with your shooting skills watching my back. The comment stayed with Sarah throughout the rest of the day. She realized that while Harrison saw her as a liability, the soldiers who would actually be risking their lives on the mission recognized her value. It was a bitter irony. The man making the decisions about her fitness for duty was the one person on base who had never seen her capabilities firsthand. 3 days later, the observation post team received their final briefing and prepared for insertion. Sarah watched from the administrative offices as 6 soldiers loaded their gear into helicopters, knowing that she should have been among them. Her expertise in reconnaissance operations, her marksmanship skills, and her intimate knowledge of similar terrain made her an ideal candidate for the mission, but Harrison's prejudices had kept her grounded. The team included Rodriguez as the medic, Wu for communications, and 4 other highly trained soldiers with specializations in reconnaissance and combat operations. They were good soldiers, Sarah knew, but she also knew that her presence could have improved their chances of success and survival. As the helicopters disappeared into the afternoon sky, Sarah made a silent promise to herself and to the soldiers now heading into harm's way. She would continue preparing herself for the day when Harrison's prejudices would no longer matter, when her skills would be needed so desperately that even he would have to acknowledge her worth as a soldier. That evening, she returned to the shooting range and spent hours perfecting her long-distance marksmanship. Each shot was a declaration of readiness, a statement that she would not be defeated by one man's narrow-minded views about what made a soldier valuable. She had overcome an enemy's bomb and months of grueling rehabilitation. She would overcome this obstacle as well. Unknown to Sarah, events were already in motion that would test every skill she had developed and every ounce of determination she possessed. The observation post mission was about to encounter complications that would require all her expertise and courage. And General Harrison, the man who had dismissed her as a liability, was about to learn firsthand just how wrong his assumptions had been. The irony was already taking shape. Sometimes the people we most need to save us are the ones we've spent the most effort pushing away. The first 48 hours of the observation post mission proceeded exactly according to plan. Rodriguez and her team successfully infiltrated the target area under cover of darkness, established their position on the ridgeline, and began monitoring enemy movement through the valley below. Their reports to base command painted a picture of significant enemy activity: supply convoys moving under cover of darkness, troop movements indicating a planned offensive, and the construction of what appeared to be a major staging area for enemy operations. Sarah monitored the mission's progress from the communications center, where her administrative duties gave her legitimate access to operational updates. Each report from the observation post validated her belief that she should have been included in the team. The intelligence they were gathering was invaluable, but she could see gaps in their reconnaissance that her experience might have filled. Still, the mission seemed to be succeeding, and she took some satisfaction in knowing that her advice during the planning stages had contributed to their initial success. On the third day, however, everything changed. The morning report from the observation post was 12 hours overdue. Wu's scheduled radio check had been missed, which was unprecedented for the meticulous communications specialist. Major Collins paced the command center like a caged animal, trying radio frequencies and coordination with other units in the area, but receiving only static in response. "Could be equipment failure," suggested Captain Morrison, the base intelligence officer. "Those radios take a beating in that terrain." General Harrison stood before the large tactical map, his face grim as he studied the red pins marking known enemy positions around the observation post. "Or they've been compromised," he said quietly. "If the enemy discovered their position, they'd jam communications before launching an assault." Sarah felt her stomach clench as she listened to the discussion. The observation post team had been inserted with minimal backup support, relying on stealth and concealment for protection. If they had been discovered, they would be vastly outnumbered and cut off from reinforcement or extraction. Throughout the day, attempts to reestablish contact continued without success. Satellite imagery showed no movement around the observation post location, but the thick forest canopy made it impossible to determine the team's status. By evening, the silence had stretched to 36 hours, and even the most optimistic officers were beginning to fear the worst. It was then that a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A patrol operating in a sector 15 miles from the observation post reported hearing distant gunfire and explosions during the previous night. The sounds had been faint and brief, lasting only 20 or 30 minutes, but the timing corresponded with when the observation post team should have made their scheduled report. "They're in contact with the enemy," Harrison concluded grimly. "The question is whether any of them are still alive." Major Collins spread additional maps across the conference table, marking potential enemy approach routes and likely defensive positions. "If they're still alive, they'll try to reach the emergency extraction point," he said. "But that's 20 miles through hostile territory, and we don't know their condition or equipment status." Sarah found herself leaning closer to the maps despite having no official role in the planning session. The emergency extraction point was located in a valley that offered helicopter access, but would be extremely dangerous for wounded or exhausted soldiers to reach. The route required crossing several ridges and navigating through areas known to be patrolled by enemy forces. "We need to send a search and rescue team," Collins continued. "Even if we can't reach them immediately, we might be able to establish contact and coordinate their movement to a safer extraction point." Harrison studied the terrain with the intensity of a general planning a major offensive. "A search and rescue operation in that area would require at least 20 soldiers, maybe more. We'd need air support, medical evacuation capabilities, and probably artillery on standby. The enemy knows we have people in that area now, so they'll be watching for exactly that kind of operation." "Sir," Sarah spoke up before she could stop herself, "what if we approach this differently?" Every head in the room turned toward her, and she realized she had just violated protocol by inserting herself into a planning session she had no business attending. But Harrison's expression was more curious than angry, perhaps because the desperate situation had temporarily overridden his usual dismissiveness toward her. "What do you mean, Lieutenant?" he asked. Sarah moved closer to the map, her mind racing through possibilities. A large search and rescue operation would announce our presence and give the enemy time to prepare an ambush. But a small team, maybe just 2 or 3 soldiers, could move through that terrain much more quietly. They could locate the observation post team, assess their condition, and guide them to safety without triggering a major engagement. You're talking about sending a few soldiers into an area where 6 highly trained operatives may have been overrun by enemy forces, Harrison replied. That's not rescue, that's suicide. Not if the team includes someone with extensive experience in that specific type of terrain and reconnaissance operations, Sarah said, knowing she was taking an enormous risk by essentially volunteering herself again. Someone who could navigate the area quickly and identify safe routes to the extraction point. The room fell silent as the implication of her words sank in. She was proposing exactly the kind of high-risk mission that Harrison had deemed her unfit for, but now circumstances had changed. The lives of 6 American soldiers hung in the balance, and conventional rescue operations might not be feasible given the enemy's heightened state of alert. Major Collins was the first to speak. The concept has merit, sir. A small, fast-moving team could cover ground more quickly than a large force and might be able to locate our people before the enemy reinforces the area. Harrison's expression remained skeptical. Even if I agreed with the tactical approach, which I'm not sure I do, who would you send on this hypothetical mission? Most of our experienced reconnaissance specialists are either already deployed or preparing for other operations. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing this was her moment to either prove herself or face final dismissal from any meaningful role in combat operations. Sir, I volunteer to lead the mission. My experience in similar terrain, combined with my marksmanship capabilities and knowledge of the observation post-team's procedures, makes me the logical choice. The silence that followed was so complete that Sarah could hear the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Harrison stared at her with an expression that mixed disbelief with something that might have been respect, though she couldn't be sure. Lieutenant Mitchell, he said slowly, you're asking me to send you alone into hostile territory to rescue 6 soldiers who may already be dead, using a prosthetic leg that you claim won't fail at a critical moment. Not alone, sir. I'd need at least one other soldier, preferably someone with medical training in case our people are wounded. And my prosthetic isn't a claim, it's a proven piece of equipment that's been tested under combat conditions. Captain Morrison looked up from his intelligence reports. Sir, if we're going to attempt any kind of rescue operation, time is critical. Every hour we wait reduces the chances that the observation post team can evade enemy patrols and reach the extraction point. Harrison walked to the window overlooking the base, his hands clasped behind his back. Sarah could see him weighing options, each one carrying enormous risks. Send a large force and potentially trigger a major engagement that could result in heavy casualties. Send no one and abandon 6 soldiers to capture or death. Or trust the soldier he had ridiculed and dismissed to accomplish what might be an impossible mission. When he turned back to face the room, his expression had hardened into the mask of command. Lieutenant Mitchell, if I authorize this mission, you'll be operating with minimal support in hostile territory. No air cover, no artillery support, no backup if things go wrong. You'll have one other soldier, whatever equipment you can carry, and about 48 hours before the enemy reinforces the area to the point where extraction becomes impossible. Sarah felt her heart racing, but her voice remained steady. I understand the parameters, sir. I'm confident we can locate the observation post team and guide them to safety. And if your prosthetic fails, if you can't keep up with the pace required to reach them in time, then I'll crawl if I have to, Sarah replied with absolute conviction. But I won't fail, sir. Those soldiers deserve someone who will risk everything to bring them home. Harrison studied her for a long moment, and Sarah could see the internal struggle playing out behind his eyes. Every instinct he possessed told him she was a liability, but the tactical situation left him few alternatives. The lives of 6 soldiers hung in the balance, and conventional wisdom might not be enough to save them. Major Collins, he said finally, prepare mission parameters for a 2-person reconnaissance and rescue operation. Lieutenant Mitchell will lead, with 1 volunteer from the medical corps. They'll insert at dawn and have 72 hours to locate our people and guide them to the extraction point. Sarah felt a surge of vindication mixed with terror. She had finally gotten the opportunity she had fought for, but it came with stakes higher than she had ever imagined. 6 soldiers' lives depended on her ability to prove that courage and competence weren't measured by the intactness of one's body. As the planning session continued into the night, Sarah found herself working alongside officers who had previously treated her as an administrative afterthought. They discussed approach routes, contingency plans, communication protocols, and emergency procedures with the kind of detailed focus that could mean the difference between success and catastrophe. Rodriguez volunteered immediately when asked for medical support, despite having just returned from the original observation post-mission planning. "Those are my people out there," she said simply. "If Mitchell thinks she can find them, I'll follow her anywhere." By dawn, Sarah found herself standing beside a helicopter, her equipment checked and rechecked, her mission parameters memorized, and her determination crystallized into an almost physical force. She had spent her entire military career preparing for moments like this, but never under circumstances that carried such personal significance. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying her toward what might be her final mission, Sarah thought about General Harrison's parting words to her. "Don't make me regret this decision, Lieutenant," he had said, but she had seen something different in his eyes, a grudging acknowledgement that perhaps he had misjudged her capabilities. Below them, the hostile terrain stretched out like a green maze, hiding somewhere within its depths 6 American soldiers who needed rescue and one commanding officer whose prejudices were about to be challenged by the very soldier he had tried to sideline. Sometimes redemption comes in the most unlikely packages, and sometimes the people we most need are the ones we've spent the most effort pushing away. The helicopter dropped Sarah and Rodriguez at the insertion point just as the first rays of dawn were breaking through the mountain peaks. The landing zone was a small clearing barely large enough for the aircraft, surrounded by dense forest that would provide cover but also limit visibility. As the helicopter disappeared back toward base, leaving only the fatting sound of rotor blades, the 2 soldiers found themselves alone in territory that had already claimed 6 of their comrades. Sarah checked her equipment one final time. Her rifle, a specialized sniper variant she had requested specifically for this mission, her prosthetic leg secured with additional reinforcement straps, and enough supplies to last 3 days if necessary. Rodriguez carried medical equipment that could treat everything from gunshot wounds to broken bones, plus her own weapon and survival gear. Together, they represented the sum total of hope for the missing observation post team. "Which way, Lieutenant?" Rodriguez asked, consulting her GPS device and comparing it to the topographical map they had studied during mission planning. Sarah oriented herself using landmarks visible through the forest canopy, a distinctive rock formation to the north, a ridge line that matched their intelligence photos, and the general direction of the valley where the observation post had been established. "The team's last known position is about 8 miles northeast," she said. "But if they've been compromised, they'll be moving toward the emergency extraction point, which means we need to intercept their likely route." The first few hours of movement through the forest tested every aspect of Sarah's preparation. The terrain was exactly as challenging as she had expected, steep slopes covered with loose rock, dense underbrush that caught at equipment and clothing, and the constant threat of enemy patrols who might be searching for the same soldiers they were trying to rescue. Sarah's prosthetic performed flawlessly, its titanium and carbon fiber construction proving more durable than biological limbs would have been under such conditions. Where Rodriguez occasionally stumbled on loose rocks or caught her boot on hidden roots, Sarah's artificial leg provided consistent stability and support. The enhanced balance she had developed during rehabilitation allowed her to navigate treacherous terrain with confidence that surprised even herself. 3 hours into their mission, they encountered their first sign of the missing team. A piece of torn fabric caught on a thorn bush matched the camouflage pattern of standard-issue uniforms. The fabric was relatively fresh, indicating it had been left within the past day or two, and its location suggested the observation post team was indeed moving toward the extraction point. "They came through here," Sarah whispered, examining the ground for additional signs of passage. "Looks like they were moving fast, probably under pressure." Rodriguez found boot prints in a patch of soft earth, confirming Sarah's assessment. 6 sets of tracks, but one of them is irregular. Someone might be injured. The discovery added urgency to their mission. Injured soldiers would move more slowly and leave clearer trails for enemy forces to follow. Sarah and Rodriguez needed to reach them before enemy patrols did, or the rescue mission could turn into a recovery operation for 8 bodies instead of 6. As they continued deeper into hostile territory, Sarah found herself drawing on skills and instincts she had developed during her previous tour. The forest seemed to speak to her, the sound of birds indicating undisturbed areas, the smell of wood smoke suggesting enemy camps, the subtle signs of recent human passage that most people would never notice. Her prosthetic leg had become so integrated into her movement patterns that she no longer thought about it consciously, allowing her to focus entirely on the mission. Around midday, they heard the distant sound of helicopter rotors, not American aircraft, but the distinctive whine of enemy transport helicopters moving troops into the area. Sarah and Rodriguez took cover under a thick canopy of leaves and waited for the sound to fade, but the implication was clear. Enemy forces were actively searching for the missing observation post team, and they had air support to coordinate their efforts. "They know our people are out here," Rodriguez whispered. "We're running out of time." Sarah studied her map, calculating distances and probable movement rates. If the observation post team maintained their planned pace, they should be about 2 miles ahead of us. But if they're injured or slowed down by pursuit, they could be anywhere in a 5-mile radius. The afternoon brought both good news and bad news. The good news was that they found more signs of the observation post team, clear evidence that at least some members were still alive and moving toward the extraction point. The bad news was that they also found signs of enemy pursuit boot prints that didn't match American patterns, cigarette butts that indicated recent rest stops, and the kind of trail signs that suggested organized search teams. As evening approached, Sarah made a decision that would define the success or failure of their mission. Instead of continuing to follow the observation post team's trail, which was becoming increasingly dangerous as enemy forces converged on the same route, she decided to move directly to the emergency extraction point and wait for them there. "It's a risk," she explained to Rodriguez as they studied their options. "If they've been captured or forced to take a different route, we'll miss them entirely. But if they're still following the plan, we can provide overwatch and protection when they reach the extraction zone." Rodriguez agreed with the assessment, and they began a grueling night movement across terrain that would have challenged even experienced mountain climbers. Sarah's prosthetic continued to perform reliably, its consistent mechanics actually providing advantages over biological limbs that might have cramped or fatigued during the prolonged exertion. They reached the extraction point just before dawn, a valley floor that provided helicopter access, but also left arriving aircraft vulnerable to ground fire from the surrounding ridges. Sarah immediately began identifying defensive positions and fields of fire, using her marksmanship expertise to select locations where she could provide effective cover for any rescue operation. It was while establishing these positions that they heard the first sounds of approaching movement, not the heavy footsteps of enemy patrols, but the careful, deliberate movement of soldiers trying to remain undetected. Sarah and Rodriguez took positions where they could observe the valley approaches while remaining hidden from potential threats. What they saw emerging from the forest nearly broke Sarah's heart. The observation post team was indeed still alive, but barely. Wu supported Corporal Jackson, who was clearly suffering from a leg wound that left him unable to walk unassisted. Rodriguez limped badly, favoring her right side, and the other team members showed signs of exhaustion and stress that spoke of days spent evading enemy patrols. But what shocked Sarah most was the seventh figure moving with the group, General Harrison himself. As the group reached the valley floor, Sarah could see that Harrison was in no better condition than his soldiers. His uniform was torn and dirty, he appeared to be suffering from dehydration, and he moved with the careful deliberation of someone pushing beyond the limits of physical endurance. Whatever had brought him to this situation, he was now just another soldier in need of rescue. Sarah activated her radio, calling for immediate helicopter extraction, while Rodriguez moved to provide medical assistance to the wounded soldiers. But even as she coordinated the rescue, Sarah knew their troubles were far from over. The sound of enemy helicopters was growing louder, and movement on the surrounding ridges indicated that hostile forces had located the extraction point. "Contact front!" shouted one of the observation post team members as enemy soldiers appeared on the ridgeline, their weapons already trained on the valley floor. Sarah found herself in exactly the situation General Harrison had claimed she was unfit for under fire, responsible for the lives of other soldiers, with her prosthetic leg the only thing standing between them and capture or death. This was the moment that would prove whether his prejudices had been justified or whether courage and competence truly came from within. As the first enemy shots rang out across the valley, Sarah took position behind a fallen log and began returning fire with the precision that had made her reputation as a marksman. Her prosthetic leg provided the stable shooting platform she needed, and her enhanced balance allowed her to maintain accuracy even under the stress of combat. But she quickly realized that marksmanship alone wouldn't be enough to save them. Enemy forces were moving to surround the extraction point, and their helicopter support would arrive long before American rescue aircraft could reach the area. If they were going to survive, Sarah would need to use every skill she had developed and every ounce of determination she possessed. The irony wasn't lost on her as she looked across the valley at General Harrison, the man who had ridiculed her prosthetic and questioned her fitness for combat operations. He was now depending on that same prosthetic and those same combat skills for his survival. Sometimes fate has a sense of poetic justice that extends beyond human understanding, and sometimes the people who need rescuing most are those who never thought they needed anyone's help. The first enemy shots shattered the morning calm like breaking glass, and Sarah felt time slow to the crystalline clarity that comes in moments of absolute crisis. Her training kicked in with mechanical precision as she identified targets on the ridge line, calculated wind speed and distance, and began returning fire with the methodical efficiency that had earned her reputation as an exceptional marksman. Her first shot dropped an enemy soldier who was attempting to establish a machine gun position that would have dominated the entire extraction zone. Her second shot eliminated a sniper who had been drawing a bead on General Harrison. Each pull of the trigger was deliberate and precise, her prosthetic leg providing the stable shooting platform that made such accuracy possible under combat conditions. "Rodriguez, get the wounded to that rock formation," Sarah called out between shots, indicating a natural defensive position that would provide cover from multiple directions. "Everyone else, establish a perimeter. We hold this position until extraction arrives." But even as she organized the defense, Sarah could see the tactical situation deteriorating rapidly. Enemy forces were approaching from 3 directions, their numbers growing as additional patrols converged on the extraction point. The helicopter sounds she had heard earlier were getting closer, and she knew they had only minutes before enemy air support arrived to make rescue impossible. General Harrison, despite his obvious exhaustion and injury, was attempting to coordinate the defense with the authority of someone accustomed to command. But Sarah quickly realized that his condition was worse than it initially appeared. He was suffering from dehydration, possibly heat exhaustion, and what looked like a significant cut on his forehead that was affecting his vision. "Sir, you need to get to cover," Sarah called to him as she reloaded her rifle. "Rodriguez can treat that head wound once we secure the perimeter." Harrison's response was to grab a rifle from one of the wounded soldiers and take position beside her, his movements sluggish but determined. "I've been in firefights since before you enlisted, Lieutenant. I can still pull my weight." It was then that Sarah saw the enemy's real strategy unfolding. While some forces engaged them from the ridges, others were moving through the forest to flank their position. If those flanking forces reached the extraction point, they would be caught in a crossfire that would make survival impossible. "Sir, we've got movement coming around the south ridge," she reported. "If they establish positions there, we'll be completely surrounded." Harrison raised his rifle and squinted through the scope, but Sarah could see he was having trouble focusing. The head wound was clearly affecting his vision, and his hands were shaking with exhaustion or shock. He would be more liability than asset in his current condition. "I can see them," he said, but his shot went wide by several feet, a miss that would have been embarrassing for any trained soldier, let alone a general with decades of combat experience. Sarah made a decision that would have seemed impossible weeks earlier when she first encountered Harrison's prejudice. "Sir, I need you to coordinate communications with base and guide the incoming helicopter. I'll handle the flanking forces." Without waiting for his response, Sarah began moving toward a position that would give her clear fields of fire on both the main enemy force and the flanking elements. Her prosthetic leg proved its worth again as she navigated the broken terrain with speed and confidence that biological limbs might not have managed under such stress. The movement required her to cross open ground that was exposed to enemy fire, But Sarah had calculated that her marksmanship advantages would offset the tactical disadvantage. She was right. As enemy soldiers turned their attention to her exposed position, she systematically eliminated threats with the kind of precision shooting that comes from years of training and natural talent enhanced by determination. Her enhanced balance and stability allowed her to engage targets while moving, something that would have been nearly impossible for most soldiers. The titanium and carbon fiber construction of her prosthetic absorbed impacts that might have thrown off her aim, and its mechanical consistency provided reliability that biological limbs, subject to fatigue and stress, could not match. But superior marksmanship could only do so much against superior numbers. Enemy forces continued to advance, and Sarah found herself in the position of trying to cover multiple approach routes simultaneously while maintaining communication with the rest of the team. It was Rodriguez who provided the tactical insight that saved them all. "Lieutenant, the ridge line position is the key," she called out during a brief lull in the firing. "If we can eliminate their overwatch, the flanking forces will be exposed crossing the valley floor." Sarah immediately understood the medic's assessment. Enemy forces on the ridge had clear observation of the entire extraction area, allowing them to coordinate the movements of their flanking elements. If she could eliminate or suppress those observers, the enemy's tactical advantage would disappear. The shot required was beyond the range where most soldiers would attempt precision fire, especially under combat conditions. But Sarah had spent countless hours during her rehabilitation perfecting her long-distance marksmanship, driven partly by the need to prove her capabilities and partly by the simple satisfaction of excelling at something she could control completely. She estimated the range at nearly 800 meters, with a significant crosswind and targets that were partially concealed behind rocks and vegetation. The shot required not just marksmanship skill, but also the kind of intuitive understanding of ballistics that comes from years of experience and natural talent. Sarah's first shot struck the enemy observer in the chest, dropping him immediately and causing the others on the ridge to take cover. Her second shot eliminated the machine gunner who had been providing suppressive fire, and her third shot destroyed the radio equipment they had been using to coordinate their assault. With their overwatch eliminated, the enemy flanking forces found themselves exposed and confused. They had been advancing based on directions from the ridge positions, and without that guidance, they were operating blind in unfamiliar terrain. It was at this critical moment that Sarah heard the distinctive sound of approaching American helicopters, not just one transport aircraft, but what sounded like a full rescue package including gunship support. General Harrison had managed to coordinate their arrival despite his condition, and the cavalry was finally coming. But the enemy forces weren't finished. As the first American helicopter appeared over the ridgeline, enemy air support arrived as well, 2 attack helicopters that immediately engaged the American aircraft in a deadly aerial dance above the extraction zone. Sarah found herself in a position she had never trained for, but somehow understood instinctively. Ground forces needed air support to survive, but air support needed ground forces to eliminate threats that aircraft couldn't engage effectively. She began targeting enemy soldiers who were attempting to establish anti-aircraft positions, using her marksmanship skills to support the helicopter battle raging overhead. Her shooting drew enemy attention back to her position, making her the focal point of their assault. But Sarah had moved to terrain that maximized her advantages while minimizing theirs. Her elevated position gave her clear fields of fire, her prosthetic provided stable shooting support, and her experience allowed her to use the terrain features for both cover and concealment. The battle reached its climax as American helicopters began landing in the extraction zone, while enemy forces made a final desperate assault on the defensive perimeter. Sarah found herself engaging targets at ranges from 10 meters to 600 meters, switching between precision long-distance shots and rapid close-quarters combat as the situation demanded. It was during this final phase of the battle that General Harrison, despite his injuries and exhaustion, made a decision that would define their relationship forever. Instead of taking shelter in the extraction helicopter, he grabbed additional ammunition and moved to support Sarah's position. "I said I could pull my weight, Lieutenant," he said, taking position beside her and adding his fire to hers. "I may not shoot as straight as you do, but I can still hit what I'm aiming at." Together, they held the line until the last wounded soldier was loaded onto the helicopter. Sarah's prosthetic leg had performed flawlessly throughout the entire engagement, never faltering or failing despite impacts, stress, and demands that would have challenged any piece of equipment. As they finally boarded the extraction helicopter, Sarah looked back at the battlefield where she had proven every point she had tried to make during her confrontation with Harrison's prejudices. Her prosthetic leg hadn't been a liability. It had been an asset that contributed to saving 7 lives, including that of the man who had ridiculed it. The flight back to base was quiet except for the sound of rotors and the medical equipment Rodriguez was using to treat the wounded. General Harrison sat across from Sarah, his head wound bandaged, his expression thoughtful as he processed what had just occurred. "Lieutenant," he said finally, his voice carrying a tone Sarah had never heard from him before, "I owe you an apology, and more than that, I owe you my life." Sarah looked at the man who had questioned her fitness for duty, who had dismissed her as damaged goods, who had seen her prosthetic leg as evidence of weakness rather than proof of strength. "Sir, you don't owe me anything. We're all soldiers. We take care of each other." But Harrison shook his head. "What I owe you is acknowledgement that I was wrong. About your capabilities, about your value as a soldier, and about what makes someone fit for combat duty. You didn't just save my life today, you proved that courage and competence have nothing to do with having all your original parts." As the helicopter approached the base, Sarah could see other soldiers gathered near the landing pad, waiting for news of the rescue operation. She realized that this mission had changed more than just her relationship with General Harrison. It had proven to herself and to everyone else that she truly had overcome the limitations that others tried to impose on her. The landing was smooth, and as they transferred the wounded to medical personnel, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the explosion that took her leg, through months of grueling rehabilitation, to facing prejudice and doubt from the man sworn to lead her, every challenge had prepared her for the moment when her skills and determination would be needed most. General Harrison was the last to leave the helicopter. As he passed Sarah, he stopped and extended his hand, not as a superior officer acknowledging a subordinate, but as one soldier recognizing another's exceptional service. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said, "I'd be honored to have you serve in any capacity in my command. Your prosthetic leg isn't a liability, it's part of what makes you one of the finest soldiers I've ever had the privilege to serve with." As Sarah watched him walk toward the medical facility, supported by Rodriguez, but moving under his own power, she realized that sometimes the most important victories aren't won on battlefields against foreign enemies. Sometimes they're won in the hearts and minds of people who have lost sight of what really makes someone valuable. Her prosthetic leg, Liberty, had carried her through the most important mission of her military career. But more than that, it had become a symbol of her refusal to be defined by limitations others tried to impose. She had proven that true strength comes from within, that courage isn't measured by physical perfection, and that sometimes the people who need rescuing most are those who never thought they needed anyone's help. The general had ridiculed her prosthetic, questioned her fitness for duty, and tried to sideline her from meaningful service. But in the end, when his life hung in the balance, that same prosthetic had helped carry him to safety. Sometimes irony is the universe's way of teaching lessons that couldn't be learned any other way.